For the viewers, I have to disclose, I met Adam at an event before. That's why I invited him to this. And he's got a very interesting take that I wanted to pursue a bit more, because it was a topic that I have not heard enough yet, in my opinion. I was just curious about it. It's the inflationary pressure that is created in the EU because of these regulations. And that's why I invited Adam, and I want to hear a bit more about that. It's not really talked about in the mainstream. So how do regulations in the EU cause or like worsen inflationary pressure? How does that work, or why is that happening? Please elaborate on that.
Sure. I think you're absolutely right. It's not talked about enough, because when we talk about inflation, we often mention monetary policy, so the role of the ECB when it comes to money printing. We often talk about the Russian war of aggression and how it leads to higher energy prices. And these are, of course, all important considerations and very much contribute to the current high levels of inflation that we're seeing across Europe. But another underappreciated angle is the role of governments, especially the role of governments when it comes to setting regulations and setting tax rates that may contribute to elevated price levels. So with 8 of our member think tanks and partners from across Europe, we essentially looked at these policies and tried to assess how much exactly they contribute and bear the burden for various parts of the inflationary basket. So to give you an example, sticking to energy policy, because I think citizens across Europe in the last year very much realized that energy can be a massive part of their expenditure. When it comes to energy policy, of course, it was a political decision to rely on Russia and Russian imports that has very questionable consequences. But even from a domestic regulatory perspective, if you look at Germany or Austria or Belgium, the governments there decided to phase out nuclear and rely on other sources of energy. This has massive costs involved. If you're shutting down nuclear power plants, even though that they are perfectly safe and well functioning, you raise the energy price levels all across Europe. If you decide to ban onshore wind, like it has happened in the United Kingdom or Hungary, then you make it less competitive for electricity producers to rely on clean, modern, and safe type of energy. And all these regulatory reasons do get combined and lead to significantly higher levels of prices across various industries. It's not only happening in the energy regulatory area, but it's happening across housing, it's happening across the agriculture industry. So there are so many different levels and layers of government regulations that leads to elevated price levels that we wanted to kind of shed light on them and ensure that maybe politicians also think about what they can do themselves to reduce these inflationary pressures and not just point to the central banks or the Russian war of aggression as the reason behind these inflationary pressures.
Again, it's an interesting topic. We in Austria had a bit of that discussion because of the huge amount of taxes on gas. And when the gas prices rose, the percentage of taxes, of course, was a really huge deal. So there was discussion if the taxes should be lowered on gas for a while or not, and how all of that. So that's why it rang my bells, and I was interested in this topic at all when I heard it from you. But the typical discussion point would be, at least after I talked to a few people, was like, well, the regulations are there to make the life better. That's the typical response that you get.
That's a claim, at least, yeah.
Yeah, so like, what is your take on that? Have you studied it? If there is actually a benefit for the people, or could it be, well, it's a claim, but it's not really, it's not really quantifiable, or can you say, no, we quantified it, but it's like a low level, or it's like, okay, yeah, it's really a big deal, but in this sector, it doesn't really matter. What is your take on that argument?
The argument that regulations are leading to a safer environment may be true under certain circumstances, but the vast majority of the cases, we can see that there's so much vested interest and so much lobbying involved that it's not necessarily the benefits to the average citizens that are the main drivers of regulations, but some of these industry lobbies. If you look at the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, almost half of the European Union's budget is spent on subsidizing farmers across the EU. This may sound great and fantastic to the farmers themselves, but if you look at the impact on the average citizen, what it means is that they are forced to pay higher levels for their basic food items because these subsidies essentially stifle competition. So Africa is a massive regional neighbor to the EU. A lot of their farmers would be incredibly keen to export more to the EU single market. But at the moment, they aren't allowed to do so because there are quotas in place and there are high tariffs in place. So what this regulation essentially does is to subsidize richer European farmers at the expense of African farmers and at the expense of the poor segments of our own societies that proportionally spend a much higher amount on basic food items. And as a result, their basic expenditure is significantly higher than it would be otherwise without the Common Agricultural Policy being in place. So although it may be beneficial to some parts of the society to have these regulations, mainly the producers themselves, the overall effects are still in that